Man alone almost turned the native girl away. By morning, golden particles floated in his stream. The scream pierced through the desert silence like a blade through leather. Samuel Hayes dropped his coffee tin, the bitter liquid hissing against the dying embers of his campfire. His weathered hands reached for the Winchester propped against a boulder, muscle memory from 20 years of frontier living taking over before his mind could catch up. 42 years old and carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mesa surrounding his claim, Samuel had learned that screams in the wilderness meant trouble, the kind that left men buried in unmarked graves or worse. His steel-gray eyes scanned the moonlit landscape, searching for movement among the sagebrush and jagged rocks that dotted his mining operation. Another scream. Closer now, female, young. Samuel cursed under his breath, his calloused fingers tightening around the rifle stock. He had come to this godforsaken corner of Arizona territory for one reason: to be alone. After Sarah died of consumption back in Missouri, after watching his dreams of family and future dissolve like sugar in rain, solitude had become his only companion. The last thing he needed was someone else's trouble bleeding into his carefully constructed isolation. The third scream came with the sound of hoofbeats thundering against hard-packed earth. Samuel crouched behind his supply wagon, peering through the gap between wooden crates filled with mining equipment and provisions. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Even in the pale moonlight, he could make out their faces painted with the harsh lines of men who had crossed every moral boundary. Bounty hunters. The worst kind. Between them, barely clinging to a spotted pony, rode a girl who could not have seen more than 18 summers. Her long black hair whipped in the night wind like a battle flag, and even at this distance, Samuel could see the defiant tilt of her chin despite the rope burns around her wrists. She wore traditional Apache clothing, the beadwork catching fragments of starlight. The lead rider, a mountain of a man with a beard that reached his chest, yanked hard on the rope tethered to the girl's mount. She pitched forward but managed to stay seated, her spine straight as an arrow shaft. "Ayanna, you keep fighting and I'll put you over my saddle like a sack of grain," the bearded man growled, his voice carrying the rough edges of too much whiskey and too little conscience. "Your grandfather's bounty says dead or alive, and I'm getting tired of alive." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew that name, Ayanna, granddaughter of Chief Nalnish, the Apache leader who had been making life difficult for the territorial government's expansion plans. The bounty on her head was substantial enough to attract every gun for hire between here and California. The girl raised her head, and for a moment her eyes seemed to find Samuel's hiding spot. Even from 30 yards away, he could see the intelligence burning there, the calculation of someone far older than her years. She was not just some helpless captive. She was planning something. "My grandfather will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Jake Morrison," she said, her English clear and precise despite the circumstances. "When he finds what remains of you, there will not be enough left to feed the buzzards." Morrison backhanded her across the face. The sound cracked like a whip through the night air. That was when Samuel made the decision that would change everything. He had sworn off getting involved in other people's business, had promised himself that Samuel Hayes was done being a hero, done caring about anything beyond the next meal and the next vein of silver ore. But something about the way the girl held herself, even with blood trickling from her split lip, reminded him of Sarah in her final days. That same fierce refusal to let the world break her spirit. Samuel rose from behind the wagon, the Winchester trained on Morrison's chest. "That's far enough, boys." The 3 men wheeled their horses toward him, hands dropping to their sidearms. Morrison's pig-like eyes narrowed as he took in Samuel's appearance. Tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by years of swinging a pickaxe and arms corded with muscle from hauling ore carts up mine shafts. His brown hair had gone silver at the temples, and a scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a Comanche raid 15 years back. "Well, well, Morrison said, settling back in his saddle with false calm. Samuel Hayes, the hermit of Copper Canyon. Heard you went soft after your woman died. Guess the stories were wrong. The stories said I went crazy, not soft, Samuel replied, his voice steady as bedrock. There's a difference. Now cut the girl loose and ride on. This doesn't concern you anymore. Morrison laughed, the sound like gravel in a tin can. She's worth $500, Hayes. That's more silver than you'll pull out of this worthless rock in 5 years. Walk away. Can't do that. Sure you can. Just turn around, go back to your fire, and pretend you never saw us. Come morning, we'll be gone, and you can go back to talking to yourself and digging holes in the ground. Samuel's finger moved to the trigger. I said cut her loose. The standoff stretched like a taut wire. Morrison's companions, a scarred man with dead eyes and a kid who looked barely old enough to shave, shifted nervously in their saddles. The girl, Ayanna, watched everything with the intensity of a hunting hawk. Morrison's hand inched toward his Colt. You know what your problem is, Hayes? You think one man with one rifle can take on 3 professionals. That's the kind of thinking that gets a man killed. Maybe, Samuel said, but I've got something you don't. What's that? Nothing left to lose. The gunfight erupted in a symphony of muzzle flashes and thunder. Samuel's first shot took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning the big man around in his saddle. The scarred man's bullet whistled past Samuel's ear, close enough to singe the hair. Samuel worked the Winchester's lever action and put 2 rounds center mass into the gunman's chest. The kid panicked, firing wild into the darkness. His horse reared, and he tumbled to the ground, scrambling for cover behind a boulder. Samuel tracked him with the rifle but held his fire. The boy was down to his last shot, and fear had made him careless. Morrison, blood streaming down his arm, fumbled for his gun with his good hand. Ayanna chose that moment to drive her heels into her pony's flanks. The animal bolted forward, and she threw herself from the saddle, rolling across the hard ground toward Samuel's position. "Behind you!" she shouted. Samuel spun just as the kid broke cover, desperation overriding common sense. The Winchester spoke once more, and the kid dropped like a felled tree. Morrison, seeing his companions dead or dying, made the smart choice. He wheeled his horse and spurred it into the darkness, leaving a trail of curses and blood drops in the desert dust. Samuel stood in the sudden silence, his ears ringing from the gunfire. Gunpowder smoke drifted through the air like morning mist. Ayanna sat on the ground where she had landed, her bound hands working frantically at the ropes around her wrists. "Hold still," Samuel said, pulling a knife from his belt. With quick, efficient strokes, he cut through her bonds. The rope fell away, revealing raw, bleeding welts on her dark skin. "Thank you," she said simply, rubbing feeling back into her hands. Samuel studied her face in the firelight. High cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes, and a mouth that suggested both kindness and determination. She was beautiful in the way of desert flowers, delicate in appearance but tough enough to bloom in the harshest conditions. "What's your real name?" he asked. "Ayanna. It means eternal blossom in my grandfather's tongue." She stood, brushing dust from her traditional dress. "And you are Samuel Hayes, the silver miner who lost his wife to the white man's coughing sickness." Samuel's jaw tightened. "How do you know about Sarah?" "My people hear many things on the wind. We know you came here to die slowly, one day at a time, until the desert takes your bones." She tilted her head, studying him with disconcerting directness. "But tonight you chose to live instead. Tonight I chose to do what was right. There's a difference. Is there?" Ayanna walked to where his coffee pot sat beside the fire. Without asking permission, she poured water from his canteen into the battered tin cup and drank deeply. A man who wishes to die does not risk himself for a stranger. Samuel watched her move around his camp with easy familiarity, as if she belonged there. It made him uncomfortable in ways he could not name. "Where will you go?" "Morrison will be back with more men, and that bounty is still on your head." I know these mountains better than any white hunter. I will find my way back to my grandfather's people. That's 2 days hard riding through country crawling with prospectors and territorial militia. You won't make it alone." Ayanna set down the cup and fixed him with that unsettling stare again. "Are you offering to help me, Samuel Hayes?" The question hung between them like smoke from his dying fire. Samuel looked at this girl, barely out of childhood, who spoke with the wisdom of someone twice her age. Everything rational in his mind told him to point her toward the pass that led north to Apache territory and wish her luck. He had done his good deed for the year, maybe for the decade. But something in her eyes reminded him of promises he had made long ago, before grief had carved out his heart and left him hollow. "I know a place," he heard himself saying. "An old mine shaft about 20 miles from here. It's played out, but there's water, and it's hidden from the main trails. You could rest there, get your strength back before making the run to your people. And why would you tell me this?" Samuel kicked dirt over the embers of his fire, watching the sparks die one by one. Because Morrison wasn't lying about one thing. Your grandfather's bounty hunters will keep coming. Every gun for hire and fortune seeker between here and Mexico will be looking for you. You need somewhere safe to plan your next move. You could collect that bounty yourself. The words stung more than they should have. Samuel turned away, beginning to gather his scattered supplies. If I was the kind of man who sold young girls to killers, I wouldn't have shot those men tonight. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened. "I am sorry. That was cruel of me to say. It was honest. Honesty's never cruel, just inconvenient." Samuel shouldered his pack and checked his rifle. "Come on. We'll travel by night and hole up during the day. Less chance of running into trouble that way." They moved through the desert like ghosts, following game trails and dry washes that would hide their passage from anyone tracking them. Samuel led the way, his miner's knowledge of the territory serving them well. Behind him, Ayanna moved with the silent grace of her people, leaving barely a trace of their passage. As they walked, she told him her story in quiet fragments. How she had been visiting a trading post near Tucson when Morrison's men ambushed her. How her grandfather had been negotiating with the territorial government, trying to secure safe passage to a reservation in New Mexico. How certain men in Phoenix had decided that Chief Nalnish was too influential to be allowed to relocate peacefully. "They want my grandfather to resist," she explained as they climbed through a narrow canyon. "If he fights, they can justify sending the cavalry to destroy our remaining bands. If he submits peacefully, he becomes a symbol of cooperation that other tribes might follow. Either way, they believe killing his granddaughter will force him to choose the path that serves their interests." Samuel absorbed this information in silence. He had seen enough of frontier politics to understand the ugly mathematics at work. Men like Morrison were just tools in a larger game being played by politicians and businessmen who would never risk their own blood. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to see my grandfather again. I want to tell him that some white men still possess honor." She paused, her hand touching his arm lightly. "And I want to understand why a man who has given up on life would risk everything for a stranger." Samuel did not have an answer for that question. Not one he was willing to speak aloud. They reached the abandoned mine as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. The entrance was little more than a black hole in the hillside, partially concealed by fallen rocks and scrub brush. Samuel led the way inside, lighting a torch from his pack to illuminate the narrow tunnel. The mine shaft extended about 50 feet into the hillside before opening into a small chamber. Someone, probably the original prospector, had carved crude shelves into the rock walls and built a fire pit in the center of the space. A thin stream of water trickled down one wall and collected in a natural basin. "It's not much," Samuel said, "but it's dry and hidden. There's enough deadfall outside to keep a small fire going for warmth." Ayanna explored the chamber with curious eyes, her fingers trailing along the tool marks in the stone walls. "How long did it take to dig this?" Probably 6 months, maybe more. Whoever worked this claim put everything he had into it. Samuel set down his pack and began arranging his supplies. Story of every miner out here. We all think we're going to find the vein that changes everything. And did you? Find what changes everything? Samuel paused in his unpacking. Thought I had once. Had a claim up in Colorado that showed real promise. Sarah and I were planning to use the money to buy land back east, maybe start a family. He shook his head. Then the vein played out and Sarah got sick and everything fell apart. So you came here to hide from disappointment. I came here to be left alone. But you were not left alone tonight. Samuel turned to find Ayanna watching him with that penetrating gaze again. In the torchlight, her face seemed to glow with an inner warmth that made his chest tight with emotions he had thought buried with his wife. No, he admitted, I wasn't. They spent the day in the shelter of the mine, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. Samuel found himself studying Ayanna as she rested, noting the way her breathing remained steady and controlled even in sleep. She was a survivor, shaped by a harder world than most women twice her age had ever known. When evening came, they shared a simple meal of hardtack and jerked beef, washing it down with clear water from the spring. The silence between them had grown comfortable, no longer weighted with suspicion or uncertainty. Tell me about your wife, Ayanna said as they sat by the small fire Samuel had built near the mine entrance. Samuel stared into the flames, seeing Sarah's face in the dancing light. She was a teacher back in Missouri. Came west because she believed civilization needed to follow the frontier, that children deserved education no matter where they lived. He smiled at the memory. She had this way of making even the roughest mining camp feel like home. Could talk a drunk out of his bottle and a gunfighter out of his anger with nothing but words. She sounds like a strong woman. Strongest I ever knew. When the consumption started taking her, she made me promise to keep living after she was gone. Said the world had too much sorrow already without me adding to it. Samuel's voice grew rough. I kept that promise for about a year. Then I stopped trying. Ayanna shifted closer to him, her shoulder almost touching his. Perhaps you kept it longer than you think. Perhaps helping a stranger in the desert was you trying to live again. Samuel met her eyes across the fire, seeing something there that made his pulse quicken. She was 18 years old, barely more than a child by some measures. But the woman looking back at him had depths that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering, of strength tested and proven. You should sleep, he said roughly. Tomorrow night will be harder. We'll be crossing open country most of the way to the northern pass. Ayanna nodded but did not move away. Samuel? Yeah? When we reach my grandfather's territory, will you come with me? I think he would like to meet the man who saved his granddaughter. The offer hung between them like a bridge across dangerous waters. Samuel knew that accepting would mean abandoning his carefully constructed isolation, stepping back into a world where other people's problems could become his own. It would mean risking the kind of hope that had nearly destroyed him when Sarah died. I'll think about it, he said finally. Ayanna smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. That is more than I dared expect. They traveled through 2 more nights, covering ground with the steady determination of people who understood that survival depended on forward motion. During the day, they sheltered in whatever cover they could find, a grove of cottonwoods near a dried riverbed, an overhang of rock that provided shade from the relentless sun. An abandoned prospector's shack that had been picked clean by scavengers. With each mile, Samuel felt something loosening in his chest, as if bands of iron that had been wrapped around his heart for 3 years were finally beginning to rust and crack. He found himself talking more, sharing stories of his mining days and his life with Sarah. Ayanna listened with a kind of attention that made every word feel important. She told him about her childhood, about learning the old ways from her grandmother while also studying English and mathematics with a missionary teacher who had earned her grandfather's trust. She spoke of the delicate balance her people tried to maintain between preserving their culture and adapting to a changing world. The young men want to fight, she explained as they walked through a moonlit valley. They see the soldiers and the settlers taking more land each year, and they believe war is the only answer. But my grandfather knows that war against the white man's army means the end of our people. What do you believe? Ayanna was quiet for a long time, her feet moving soundlessly through the scattered stones. I believe that survival sometimes requires sacrifices that feel like death, but I also believe that some things are worth dying for. On the third night, they reached the foothills that marked the beginning of Apache territory. Samuel called a halt beside a natural spring that bubbled up from between two massive boulders. The water was sweet and cold, and they both drank deeply before refilling their canteens. "From here, you should be safe," Samuel said, settling back against one of the rocks. "Your grandfather's warriors patrol these hills, and Morrison won't risk bringing a large force this far north." "And what will you do?" Samuel looked out over the landscape they had crossed together. Somewhere back there was his mining claim, his solitary camp, his carefully maintained isolation. The thought of returning to that emptiness felt like contemplating his own grave. "I don't know," he admitted. Ayanna moved to sit beside him, close enough that he could smell the sage and wood smoke scent of her hair. "My grandfather has great wisdom, but he also has great need. The reservation where our people are meant to go has little water and poor soil. The government agents promise supplies that rarely come. A man with knowledge of mining and the white man's ways could be valuable to our survival. You're asking me to abandon everything I know. I am asking you to choose life over death, to choose hope over despair." She placed her hand over his, her skin warm against his weathered palm. "I am asking you to trust that some things are worth the risk of caring again." Samuel stared down at their joined hands, feeling something he had not experienced since Sarah's funeral. Not just desire, though that was certainly present, but a sense of possibility that made his breath catch in his throat. "Ayanna," he said carefully, "you're young enough to be my daughter. People would say I was taking advantage, that a girl your age couldn't possibly know what she wants." Her grip on his hand tightened. "Those people do not know what I have seen, what I have survived. They do not know that Apache women choose their own paths, that we are taught to recognize strength and honor in a man regardless of his age." She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes reflecting starlight. "They do not know that sometimes the heart sees what the mind cannot understand. And what does your heart see? A man who has been alone too long. A man who saved my life not because he hoped for reward, but because his soul still remembers what it means to be good." She lifted her free hand to touch the scar that ran along his jaw. "A man who could learn to live again if he found the right reason." Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her touch seep through skin that had gone cold years ago. Every rational part of his mind screamed warnings about the complications, the cultural barriers, the sheer impossibility of what she seemed to be suggesting. But beneath those voices, he heard something else. Sarah's voice, as clear as if she were sitting beside him. "Keep living, Samuel. The world has too much sorrow already." When he opened his eyes, Ayanna was still watching him with that steady, patient gaze. In her face, he saw not the impulsive passion of youth, but the deliberate choice of a woman who understood exactly what she was offering. "If I come with you," he said slowly, "if I meet your grandfather and try to find a place among your people, what happens between us? What happens is what we choose to happen. Nothing more, nothing less." Samuel turned his hand palm up, allowing their fingers to intertwine. "I'm not an easy man to live with. I've got habits that might seem strange to your people. I talk to myself when I'm working, and I don't always trust easily. And I am the granddaughter of a chief who has sworn to resist American expansion. I have been educated by missionaries and warriors alike. I speak 3 languages and can disappear into these mountains for weeks without being found." She smiled. "We will both have much to learn." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the night sounds of the desert. For the first time in 3 years, Samuel felt something other than emptiness in his chest. It was fragile, this new feeling like a green shoot pushing up through hard ground. But it was real. "There's something you should know," he said eventually. "About my claim, about why I was really out there alone." "Tell me." Samuel took a deep breath, preparing to share the secret he had carried since arriving in Arizona territory. "The claim isn't worthless. I've been pulling silver out of that mountain for 2 years, more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I told everyone it was played out because I didn't want partners or attention. I just wanted to be left alone with my grief." Ayana absorbed this information without surprise. "And now?" "Now I'm thinking that silver could do a lot of good for people who need it. Could buy supplies for a reservation, or horses, or maybe even influence with the right territorial officials. You would give up your fortune for my people? I'd invest it in our future, yours and mine, and whoever else we decide to care about along the way." Ayana leaned closer, and Samuel caught his breath as she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of starlight and possibility. When they broke apart, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Then we are truly partners," she whispered. As dawn approached, they made their way up the final ridge that would bring them into the heart of Apache territory. Samuel felt his nerves tightening with each step, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether his decision to trust and hope over fear had been wise or foolish. They crested the ridge just as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. Spread out below them was a hidden valley where smoke rose from carefully concealed fires and horses grazed in natural meadows. At the center of the settlement stood a large lodge decorated with symbols that spoke of authority and wisdom. "My grandfather's home," Ayana said, pointing to the decorated lodge. "Are you ready to meet Chief Nalnish?" Samuel shouldered his rifle and adjusted the pack that contained samples of silver ore from his claim. As ready as a man can be for the rest of his life. They walked down into the valley together, side by side, as the golden morning light transformed the world around them into something that looked very much like hope made manifest. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly toward a past that no longer held them. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, and the kind of future that was built one choice at a time by people brave enough to believe in tomorrow. And in the stream that ran through the heart of the Apache camp, tiny particles of gold caught the sunrise and danced like promises in the clear, cold water.